The thrill of independence. It was Malik's first solo trip, a milestone that made him feel equal parts excited and nervous. He had always been the type of teenager who liked the comfort of familiarity, but today he was venturing into the unknown, and there was something exhilarating about it. For months, he had been dreaming of this moment, the day he would step onto a plane by himself, fly to a different city, and experience the world beyond his hometown. He had worked hard to save up for the trip, and even planned every detail with the help of his mom, who had been both excited and a little apprehensive about his solo adventure. "Stay calm, Malik. You've got this," his mother had said over and over as she went through the checklist with him. "Remember, you belong anywhere you go. Be respectful, follow the rules, and everything will be fine." Her words had been a comforting reminder, but now, as he stood in the bustling airport, those same words seemed to echo in his mind with a new kind of weight. This wasn't just any trip. It was the beginning of something bigger, something that would shape him. Malik had always looked up to people who could go anywhere, do anything, and stand tall in the face of the unknown. Today, it was his turn to do just that. He clutched his boarding pass tightly, a symbol of his independence. He had already gone through security and was now walking toward his gate, the sounds of chatter and footsteps blending into a background hum. It felt surreal, as though the world was unfolding before him in a way he had never experienced. The airport was large, a maze of hallways and terminals, but Malik didn't feel lost. His mom's advice had stuck with him. Be confident, walk with purpose. And that's exactly what he did. He navigated the wide, open spaces with a sense of pride, his footsteps echoing lightly on the polished floors. Every now and then, he'd glance at his phone, checking the time, and making sure he was at the right gate. When the flight was finally called, he joined the line with the other passengers. His stomach did a little flip of excitement as the moment he had dreamed of for so long drew closer. He handed his ticket to the gate agent, who gave him a warm smile and scanned the document quickly. It felt like a rite of passage. Nothing could stop him now. His hands, though slightly trembling, were steady enough as he handed over the boarding pass. Walking down the narrow aisle of the plane, Malik marveled at how small and cramped it felt. It was nothing like the spaciousness of the airport, but in this confined space, there was something peaceful about being so close to the people around him. He walked past the flight attendants who were standing along the aisle, greeting passengers. Most of them smiled at him with a politeness that made him feel welcomed. However, one woman, who we'll call Sarah, caught his attention. Her gaze flickered over him for just a second, her lips pressed into a tight line. Malik didn't know what to make of it, but he tried not to dwell on it. Maybe he was overthinking things. He found his seat by the window and settled in, putting on his headphones. The noise of the plane beginning to fill with passengers was a familiar sound, but this time it had a different significance. This time, he was alone. He looked out the window as the plane slowly filled, imagining what the view would be like once they took off. There was something magical about seeing the world from above. It was the dream he had held onto for so long, and now it was about to come true. Malik closed his eyes for a moment, trying to calm the nervous excitement that was bubbling inside him. He thought about his family, how proud they would be when he returned from his first solo trip. He could already picture their faces when he shared his stories of what he had seen. But despite the excitement, there was also a tinge of uncertainty. What would it be like to navigate a new place on his own? How would he handle it if things went wrong? It was a lot to think about, but Malik told himself that he could do it. This was his moment to shine, to prove to himself that he was capable. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, Malik's mind wandered back to his mother's words. "Stay respectful." He repeated it in his mind like a mantra, a reminder that he could handle whatever came his way. The engines roared as the plane gathered speed, and with each passing second, Malik could feel his excitement building. Soon, they would be airborne, and he would be flying through the sky, free and independent. But just as the plane began to take off, something unexpected happened. A voice interrupted his thoughts, cold and stern. "Let me see your ticket." Malik blinked, momentarily confused, as the flight attendant, Sarah, appeared beside his seat. Her eyes were narrowed, her face stern as she spoke in a clipped tone. "Excuse me," Malik replied, taking off his headphones. "I said, let me see your ticket," Sarah repeated, her voice sharp and unwavering. Malik, still trying to process what was happening, handed her the boarding pass. He felt a strange unease in his stomach, but he pushed it aside, thinking that maybe there was some mistake. She scrutinized the ticket as though she were searching for something, her gaze moving over the details with a meticulousness that left him feeling more uncomfortable by the second. When she handed it back to him, there was no apology, no acknowledgement of the awkwardness of the situation. Just a cold, detached look before she moved on down the aisle. Malik couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but he didn't have the time to dwell on it. He put his headphones back in, trying to focus on the flight ahead. However, just a few minutes later, Sarah returned. This time, her expression was even sterner. "You're in the wrong seat," she said, her voice raised enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Malik's heart skipped a beat. He glanced around, catching the eyes of a few passengers who seemed unsure, confused by what was happening. "But I'm in the right seat," Malik said softly, his voice shaky but trying to hold on to a sense of calm. He remembered his mom's advice: stay respectful. But this was something entirely different. Sarah's gaze hardened. "I don't care. You need to get up and leave now." Her tone brooked no argument. A wave of humiliation hit Malik like a wave crashing over him. His face burned with embarrassment as he stood up, aware of the eyes that followed him, the whispers that began to ripple through the cabin. This was supposed to be his moment, his first solo trip, something he'd been looking forward to for months. But now, all he could feel was the sting of being singled out, of being treated like he didn't belong. He walked down the aisle, his feet heavy, his chest tight. Every step felt like it was taking him farther away from the excitement and independence he had felt just moments before. His heart pounded and his mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What had he done wrong? Why had he been treated this way? As Malik made his way toward the gate, his thoughts swirled in a fog of confusion and hurt. The cold stare of injustice. Malik stood at the gate, his back turned to the plane that was now behind him, his thoughts spiraling as he tried to comprehend what had just transpired. The hum of the airport seemed distant, like a dull echo as his mind replayed the events that led up to this moment. Every word that Sarah had spoken felt like a slap, each one heavier than the last, cutting deeper into the confidence he had once felt. As he stood alone, the weight of humiliation settled over him like a blanket, suffocating him with its intensity. His palms were clammy, his breathing shallow. It was the first time he had ever felt so small, so invisible, despite being in the middle of a crowded airport. The faces around him were mere blurs, a cacophony of voices that didn't matter. All that mattered was the feeling that something was wrong, that he had been treated unjustly for reasons he couldn't understand. His heart raced, not from excitement, but from a sense of helplessness that clung to him. Malik replayed the moment in his head over and over again. "I'm in the right seat," he had said, but the words felt meaningless now. Sarah hadn't listened. She hadn't cared. She had been so quick to dismiss him, to make him feel like an outsider on a journey that should have been his to claim. It was more than just the act of being removed from his seat. It was the sting of being treated differently, as though he was unworthy of the same respect that others received without question. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him to be strong, to stand his ground. But in that moment, Malik wasn't sure where his strength had gone. He stood at the gate, staring down at the polished floor, trying to push back the tears that threatened to rise in his chest. He could already feel the warm pressure of them at the corners of his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He had to be strong. His mother had entrusted him with this trip, and he wasn't going to let her down. The thought of calling her crossed his mind, telling her what had happened, telling her that he had been humiliated, that he had been sent away from the plane for no reason he could understand. But no, he thought. She had already done so much to prepare him for this moment. She had packed his bags, checked his itinerary, ensured that he knew how to navigate the airport. He didn't want to burden her with this. He didn't want her to worry. So he stood there, his chest heavy, his eyes dry, but his heart aching. He wondered if anyone would stand up for him. He wondered if anyone would care enough to say something, to stop what was happening. But the more he thought about it, the more the hopelessness crept in. No one seemed to be stepping forward. No one seemed to be offering him a hand, and he was left alone with his thoughts, feeling smaller with each passing second. Across the terminal, Carla, a middle-aged woman traveling for work, had been watching everything unfold from the moment Malik had boarded. She had seen how the flight attendants had greeted the passengers, how most had been treated with kindness, but when Sarah had approached Malik, something in Carla's gut told her that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the abruptness of Sarah's actions. It was the coldness in her eyes, the dismissive way she had treated Malik that made Carla pause. It wasn't just the mistake of a confused flight attendant. It was something deeper, something more deliberate. Carla had watched as Sarah had demanded to see Malik's ticket, scrutinized it as though searching for some imperfection, and then ordered him to leave. She saw Malik's confusion, the hurt in his eyes as he tried to explain himself. But Sarah hadn't listened. Carla could feel her own heart sink as Malik had been led off the plane, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of confusion and shame. She knew, deep in her gut, that something needed to be done about this. She couldn't just sit by and do nothing. Without hesitation, Carla pulled out her phone and began recording. She had seen situations like this before, too many times, in fact. Instances where people, especially young black men, were mistreated or discriminated against, and no one spoke up. Where a person's word was taken as law simply because of their position, their authority, or their race. And all too often, the stories of those who were wronged went unheard, dismissed as misunderstandings or just the price of being different. Carla wasn't about to let that happen here. She knew that sometimes the only way to hold people accountable was to make the truth visible, to make sure that the world saw what was happening. She kept the camera steady as she recorded Malik standing at the gate, looking lost and vulnerable, his expression a mixture of confusion, hurt, and disbelief. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands trembled slightly, as though he was trying to hold himself together. She didn't know his name, but she knew what she was witnessing was wrong. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a violation, a harsh reminder of the biases that existed just below the surface, and she wasn't going to let it go unnoticed. As Carla uploaded the video to social media, she crafted a simple but powerful caption. Young black boy unfairly removed from flight by a flight attendant. No explanation given. This is not okay. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell the world what had happened, to shine a light on the injustice, and, hopefully, to spark a conversation about it. Within minutes, the post began to gain attention. Comments poured in, expressing outrage and disbelief. People who had seen the video were furious, some with the airline, others with the flight attendants' actions, but all were united in their demand for accountability. The post was shared over and over again, spreading like wildfire, reaching hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. The message was clear. This kind of behavior would not be tolerated. The video didn't take long to make its way to the airline's customer service team. As the post gained traction, the airline's social media department realized the gravity of the situation. Calls and emails began flooding in, with customers demanding answers. By the time the post had gone viral, the situation had reached a boiling point. The airline's reputation was on the line, and they needed to act quickly. Just 11 minutes after the video had been posted, a supervisor at the airport was alerted to the situation. She rushed to the gate where Malik stood, still alone, his back turned to the world. She could see the young man standing there, his posture a mix of sadness and uncertainty. Malik didn't hear her approach at first. He was lost in his own thoughts, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions that had overtaken him. But then he heard his name. Malik. The supervisor called softly, her voice warm and genuine. Malik turned to face her, his eyes red from holding back tears. The supervisor smiled gently, her face filled with concern. She introduced herself as a manager from the airline and immediately began apologizing for what had happened. Malik was taken aback by her kindness. Her sincerity was obvious, and for the first time since he had been forced off the plane, he felt like someone truly cared. "I'm so sorry for what you've experienced," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I've seen the video, and I'm here to make this right." Malik listened as the supervisor explained that they would take immediate action to address the situation. She asked him to share what had happened, and he told her his side of the story, his voice shaking but steady. The supervisor listened without interruption, her face reflecting her own growing outrage as she processed the details. After a few moments, she assured Malik that they would investigate the situation thoroughly and that Sarah's behavior would not be tolerated. "Would you like to board the plane again?" she asked gently. "We'll make sure you're taken care of." Malik hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure what to think anymore. But as he stood there, facing the supervisor's empathy, something inside him began to shift. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for things to be made right. The unexpected support. The supervisor led Malik back toward the gate, her steps measured and deliberate. For the first time in what felt like hours, Malik could feel a glimmer of hope pushing through the heavy weight of confusion and hurt that had been clouding his mind. The air around him, once oppressive, now felt a little lighter, as though the moment of injustice was beginning to loosen its grip on him. The path ahead was still unclear, but something was shifting. He wasn't alone anymore. Someone had noticed what had happened, and they were doing something about it. As they neared the gate, Malik's eyes scanned the area, but it was the passengers on the plane that caught his attention. They were still there, seated and waiting, but this time, there was a quiet energy that filled the cabin. Malik noticed the way the passengers were exchanging glances, some of them whispering to each other, others just watching in silence. There was a palpable tension in the air, a subtle understanding that something significant had just happened. It wasn't lost on Malik that a few of them were looking at him differently now. The expressions had changed. Gone were the skeptical or indifferent stares, replaced with a silent acknowledgement of what had transpired. When Malik stepped back onto the plane, the atmosphere felt different. The space, once unfamiliar and intimidating, now seemed oddly welcoming. As he made his way down the aisle, he was greeted by a few quiet nods and even some soft smiles. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that there were people who recognized the injustice and who were silently showing their support. Each gesture, though small, felt like a wave of solidarity washing over him, reminding him that he wasn't alone. Carla, sitting near the back of the plane, had kept a low profile during Malik's return. She was keenly aware of the eyes that had followed Malik's movements, the hushed conversations that had rippled through the cabin. As the supervisor led him down the aisle, Carla watched closely, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and relief. She had done what she could, recording the incident, sharing the video, and making sure that Malik's voice was heard. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it was a step. And seeing Malik return to the plane, his shoulders a little straighter than before, was a sign that perhaps, just perhaps, things might start to change. As the supervisor asked Sarah to step aside, the murmurs in the cabin grew louder. The tension that had hung over the passengers like a thick fog was now replaced with an undercurrent of curiosity and support. Sarah's face, once filled with the authority of someone in charge, shifted to one of surprise. Her lips parted slightly as she was asked to leave, her brow furrowing in disbelief. It was the kind of reaction that told everyone in the cabin everything they needed to know, that she hadn't expected any pushback, let alone an apology from the airline for her behavior. The supervisor, whose name was Angela, moved quickly but calmly, guiding Sarah away from the aisle and to the back of the plane. The flight attendants who had witnessed the earlier exchange exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. The quiet tension in the air remained as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Malik, meanwhile, made his way back to his seat. As he walked, his eyes caught a few of the passengers' gazes, sympathetic glances, nods of support, and even a few murmured words of encouragement. For the first time since he had been removed from the plane, he felt like he was being seen not for the color of his skin, but for the dignity and respect he deserved. The brief moment of humiliation had been unbearable, but the support that was slowly building around him began to heal the wound. The passengers had seen what had happened, and they were standing by him, even if just in small, quiet ways. He took his seat by the window, the same seat where he had been moments earlier, but this time it felt different. The view out the window had always been something he'd looked forward to, but now it was more than just the beauty of flight. It was a symbol of something greater. It was a reminder that despite the forces that sought to make him feel small, he was still there. He was still flying. He was still moving forward. As the plane took off, Malik's thoughts drifted to the moments before. His hands were still shaking slightly, but not from fear. This time, it was from something else, something that had started to build deep within him. Resilience, a sense of purpose that he hadn't quite understood until now. The injustice that had been done to him hadn't broken him. It had made him stronger. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the climb to cruising altitude, and for a brief moment, the sound of the engines drowned out all other noise. Malik closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, letting the hum of the plane settle over him. The world outside the window was vast and endless, and Malik felt a new sense of power surging through him. The world, for all its cruelty, could also be a place of kindness and support. He had seen that today, and he knew, deep in his bones, that the strength to keep moving forward came not from the destination, but from the journey itself, the journey that had already started, one moment, one act of courage at a time. Carla sat quietly, still holding her phone, though she didn't feel the need to record anymore. She knew that the video had done its part. The outrage, the support, the calls for accountability. They were already making waves. Malik's story was no longer just his. It had become everyone's story. The story of a young man who had been wronged, but who had found the courage to stand tall. The story of a community, strangers, no less, who had come together to make sure that justice wasn't just a word, but a reality. Back on the ground, as the plane began its descent, Malik could feel the excitement bubbling up again. The emotional whirlwind that had consumed him during the flight hadn't faded, but it had shifted. He had been reminded of something essential. There were people out there who cared. And that made all the difference. When the plane finally touched down, Malik was already thinking ahead. He knew the moment he stepped off the plane, he'd be greeted by his family, his mother, father, and siblings, all eager to hear about his trip. But this time, when he shared his story, it wouldn't just be about his first solo adventure. It would be about something deeper. It would be about standing up for yourself, even when the odds feel stacked against you. It would be about the power of community and how, together, they had turned a moment of injustice into something meaningful. As he walked through the airport, heading toward his family, Malik felt a surge of gratitude for the strangers who had shown him kindness, for the supervisor who had taken swift action, and for Carla, whose simple decision to hit record had set a chain of events into motion. Without them, he would have walked away from this experience feeling broken, forgotten. But now, as he approached the baggage claim, his heart was full of something else, a quiet, unshakable strength, and he knew, without a doubt, that his journey was far from over. The echoes of change. As Malik made his way through the airport toward his family, the weight of what had happened still lingered on him, but the oppressive feeling had begun to shift. He could feel the cool air against his skin, the hum of the busy terminal around him, but something had changed within himself. The uncertainty and pain that had gripped him earlier had loosened, replaced by a quiet, newfound resilience. He wasn't sure how to explain it, but he knew that he wasn't the same person who had stepped onto that plane a few hours ago. He had learned something. Something about himself, about people, and about the power of standing up, even when it felt impossible. His family was waiting for him near the exit. They had been following the unfolding events online, and when they saw him, their faces lit up with relief and concern. His mother, always the first to show warmth and love, was the first to pull him into a tight embrace. Her arms wrapped around him with an unspoken understanding, a mix of emotions flooding between them. Malik could feel the lingering tension in her body, a mother's worry that had been building since the moment she'd first read the post on social media. "You're okay, Malik?" she asked softly, pulling away to look at him closely, as if checking to make sure he was truly all right. Malik nodded, but the truth was more complicated than a simple yes. His heart still carried the heaviness of what had happened, but it wasn't just the hurt that lingered. It was the support, the unexpected outpouring of compassion from strangers, the people who had stood by him without knowing him. It was the realization that even in the face of discrimination and injustice, there were voices ready to rise up and demand change. The weight of all of that was still settling inside him, but it gave him a quiet sense of peace. "I'm okay," he said, his voice steady, but there was an unmistakable sense of pride in his words. He wasn't sure how to explain everything that had happened in a few short hours, but he didn't have to. His family could see it in his eyes. They had seen the hurt, the confusion, and the frustration on his face earlier. And now they saw something else, something unspoken, but deeply felt. They made their way to the car, Malik's parents talking quietly about how they had seen the video online and how the airline had responded so quickly. Carla's actions, which had seemed like a small gesture at first, had grown into something much bigger. By the time Malik had landed, the video had gone viral. It had spread across social media like wildfire, capturing the attention of countless people who felt the injustice of what had happened to him. Malik's name, which had once been hidden in the shadows of a nameless, faceless teenager on a flight, was now a symbol of something much greater. The video had done more than just capture an incident. It had started a conversation. The hashtag Justice for Malik was trending, with people from all walks of life expressing their outrage, sharing their own stories of discrimination, and calling for accountability. The pressure on the airline had been intense, and within hours, the company had issued a formal apology, vowing to investigate the situation and make changes to prevent something like this from happening again. Malik had never imagined that his experience would spark such a movement. He had just wanted to go on his first solo trip and see the world, but now, his story was bigger than him. His experience was a catalyst for change, for a discussion about bias, prejudice, and accountability in the places where we least expect it. And it wasn't just his story anymore. It was everyone's story who had ever been silenced, ignored, or mistreated. That night, after Malik had shared everything with his family, his feelings, his confusion, and the emotional toll of the day, his mother sat him down and spoke with him quietly. There was a tenderness in her voice, but also a deep pride. "You were so strong, Malik," she said, her hand resting on his. "I don't know if I could have handled something like that at your age. But you did. You stood your ground. And I'm so proud of you." Malik felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't just the fact that his mother was proud of him. It was the realization that the strength he had found wasn't just for himself. It was for the people who had supported him, who had taken the time to listen, who had stood up for him in ways he had never expected. It was for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or voiceless. His story was their story too. In the days that followed, the impact of the incident continued to ripple out. The video of Malik's ordeal had reached a wide audience, and it wasn't just being shared by individuals. It had been picked up by major media outlets. News stations had aired segments about the airline's mishandling of the situation, and experts weighed in on issues of race and bias in everyday life. Malik had become an unexpected figure in a conversation about social justice, and though it was something he hadn't asked for, he was starting to realize the power of his voice. The airline had taken swift action. They had released a public statement apologizing to Malik and acknowledging the incident. But the apology alone wasn't enough. They had pledged to implement better anti-bias training for their staff, to ensure that all employees were held accountable for their actions. They promised to take proactive steps toward creating a more inclusive environment for all passengers, regardless of their background. It wasn't just the airline that had responded, though. Malik's story had sparked conversations in his community and beyond. Local activists and organizations reached out to offer their support, seeing in his experience a reflection of the systemic issues they had been fighting against for years. They recognized the significance of his story, not just as an isolated incident, but as part of a larger pattern of discrimination that still affected too many people in their everyday lives. At school, Malik had become a quiet symbol of courage. His classmates, who had seen the video or heard about it, approached him with a mix of curiosity and admiration. Some had been unaware of the struggles that people like Malik faced, and his story had opened their eyes to the harsh realities of bias and prejudice that still existed in the world. It was a humbling experience for Malik to know that his journey had made such an impact on those around him. But he also knew that the real work was just beginning. He had learned that justice wasn't something that happened automatically. It was something that had to be fought for, something that had to be demanded. And even though Malik had experienced a personal victory in this moment, he knew there were so many others who were still waiting for their moment of justice. The fight was far from over, and Malik was determined to keep speaking out, to keep standing tall, and to use his voice in whatever way he could. Carla, the woman who had filmed the video, had become something of a hero in her own right. The media had reached out to her for interviews, and she had been overwhelmed by the response. She had never expected that her decision to hit record would change so much. It had been a small act, one that had seemed insignificant in the moment, but now it was clear that it had been the spark that had ignited a much larger fire. She wasn't an activist, just an ordinary person who had witnessed something wrong and had felt compelled to act. But she had learned that sometimes the smallest actions could make the biggest difference. As Malik's story continued to unfold in the public eye, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come since that first moment of confusion on the plane. He had gone from feeling small and powerless to feeling like a part of something much bigger. His journey wasn't just about a solo trip. It was about the resilience of a community, the courage to stand up in the face of adversity, and the power of voices united for justice. When Malik looked out the window now, whether from his family's car or from his bedroom, he no longer saw just the world beyond. He saw the future, a future where people like him would no longer be made to feel small. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that change was possible, and he was ready to be a part of it. This journey had only just begun, and no matter where it would take him, Malik was certain of one thing: he belonged, and the world would soon know it too. The ripple effect of courage. The days following Malik's return home from his first solo trip were filled with a whirlwind of emotions, both for him and for those who had followed his story. What had started as a simple journey to see a new city had transformed into a moment of social significance, one that he had never imagined would ripple out beyond the confines of the airport or even his own experience. But Malik now found himself at the heart of a conversation that was far bigger than he was, and it was a conversation that he couldn't ignore, even if he wanted to. At home, his parents watched closely as the media continued to cover the unfolding story. The coverage wasn't just limited to the airline's apology or the internal investigation they had promised to conduct. It had grown into something much broader. News stations across the country were now discussing racial bias in the workplace, focusing on stories of mistreatment and discrimination that had been swept under the rug for too long. Malik's name had become a symbol for those who were often overlooked, ignored, or mistreated because of their race, and his quiet act of standing his ground was now seen as an example of resilience, of the courage to demand dignity in the face of injustice. Malik found himself thrust into the spotlight in a way he never expected. At first, he felt a bit uneasy with the attention. The public interest in his story seemed both overwhelming and humbling. He had always been a quiet kid, more comfortable blending into the background than being in the center of any drama. But now, every conversation at school seemed to circle back to him. His classmates who had once barely acknowledged his presence now approached him with a mixture of respect, curiosity, and in some cases, guilt. They had seen the video. They had heard his story. And they felt as if they had a responsibility to understand the world in a way they hadn't before. At school, Malik was quickly approached by a group of students from the diversity club. They had been moved by his experience and wanted to know if he would be willing to share his story at an upcoming assembly, to speak out about what had happened and how it had affected him. Malik hesitated at first, unsure if he was ready to stand in front of a crowd and talk about such a painful and public experience. But as he thought about it, he realized that this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had faced similar struggles, who had been denied dignity, respect, and equality. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. When the day of the assembly arrived, Malik stood backstage, feeling the weight of the moment. The gymnasium was packed with students, teachers, and faculty, all waiting to hear from the young man who had captured the public's attention. Malik had never imagined that something as simple as a flight to a new city could lead to a crowd this large. But here he was, facing the sea of faces that now looked to him for answers, for perspective, for courage. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding as the doors opened, and the spotlight fell on him. The gym went silent, and Malik stepped forward to the podium. The faces staring back at him were filled with anticipation, but he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. This wasn't about being perfect. This wasn't about delivering the most polished speech. It was about sharing his truth, no matter how raw or uncomfortable. "Hello, everyone," Malik began, his voice steady but quiet at first. "I want to talk about something that happened to me recently. Some of you may have heard about it. Some of you may have seen the video online." He paused, looking around the room, feeling the weight of every gaze on him. But instead of shrinking under the pressure, he stood tall, grounding himself in the knowledge that this moment wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible, rejected, or dismissed. "It started out as my first solo trip, a chance to see the world on my own, to experience something new." Malik continued, his words flowing more easily as he spoke. "But then something happened that I didn't expect. I was asked to leave the plane by a flight attendant, someone who treated me like I didn't belong. And in that moment, I felt small. I felt like I was invisible." The room was still, the only sound being the soft shuffle of feet and the occasional cough. Malik's words had hit home, and he could feel the weight of his own story being shared by the people around him. This wasn't just his story. It was the story of anyone who had ever been made to feel less than, the story of anyone who had experienced injustice and wondered if anyone would listen. But something changed after that. Malik said, his voice gaining strength. "A woman named Carla decided to record what happened. She posted it online, and before I knew it, the story went viral. People, strangers, people I've never met, began to speak out, to demand justice, and I realized that I wasn't alone, that this wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who has faced discrimination, everyone who has felt invisible." As Malik spoke, he could see the faces in the audience changing. Some students were nodding along. Others were leaning in as if they were hearing something that they hadn't fully understood before. He knew that many of them had never experienced anything like what he had gone through, but through his story, they were starting to see the world from a different perspective. "Carla didn't have to record that video," Malik continued. "She didn't have to get involved, but she did. And because of that small act, my story was heard. And because my story was heard, change started to happen. The airline issued an apology, and they promised to make things right. But more than that, people started talking. They started standing up. Malik took a moment, his eyes scanning the audience, seeing the impact his words were having. He felt a sense of power. Power that didn't come from anger, but from the knowledge that his voice mattered, that his story mattered. "The point is," Malik said, his voice clear and firm, "we all have a choice. We can either stand by and let things happen, or we can take action. We can choose to speak out, to make a difference. And when we do, it doesn't just change our lives, it changes the world around us." There was a pause in the room as Malik's words settled. Then, slowly, the sound of applause began to rise. It wasn't a loud, boisterous applause, but a quiet, reverent one. One that spoke of understanding, of respect, of acknowledgement. Malik stood at the podium, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and gratitude. The crowd's reaction wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had been impacted by the message he was sharing. As he stepped off the stage, the students who had been watching him approached, some with questions, others with words of encouragement. They wanted to know more, to understand more about what it felt like to experience discrimination, to feel like an outsider. Malik found himself sharing more, talking about the complexities of race and the power of empathy, about how every small act of courage could spark a wave of change. Back home, the conversation continued. Malik's family saw the ripple effect of his courage spread beyond just the school assembly. His story had sparked dialogue in local communities, on social media, and even among local leaders. People were talking about how to create more inclusive spaces, how to hold organizations accountable, and how to ensure that incidents like the one Malik had experienced didn't continue to happen. Malik wasn't just part of a story anymore. He was part of a movement. His experience had ignited something deep within others, a desire to make the world a better, fairer place. The impact of Malik's journey wasn't something that could be measured by headlines or hashtags alone. It was in the conversations that took place late into the night, in the small acts of kindness that started to ripple out into the world, in the collective understanding that justice, dignity, and respect were rights that belonged to everyone, no matter who they were. Malik's journey had begun with a solo trip, but it had turned into something far more powerful. It had turned into a call for change, and in the process, he had found his voice. A voice that would continue to speak out, to fight for justice, and to inspire others to do the same. And though the journey was far from over, Malik knew one thing for sure. His story wasn't just his own. It was the story of every person who had ever stood up in the face of adversity, who had demanded to be seen and heard. It was a story that would echo for years to come. A story of courage, solidarity, and the power of standing together. The power of solidarity. The weeks that followed Malik's speech at school were a whirlwind of activity, not only for him, but for his entire community. What had started as a personal ordeal, one that Malik had thought would remain isolated in the confines of his flight experience, had evolved into a catalyst for change. His name had become synonymous with a movement, a symbol of standing up in the face of injustice, and a voice for those who had long been silenced. But it wasn't just Malik who felt the power of this moment. His entire community, his family, and even the strangers who had shown support were now a part of something much bigger. Back at home, Malik's family had become deeply involved in the conversation about racial justice that had erupted in the wake of the viral video. His mother, who had always been an advocate for fairness, found herself participating in community meetings, speaking with local leaders about how the experiences of young people, particularly young black men, could be better understood and addressed. She had witnessed firsthand how the incident had shaken her son, but she also saw how Malik had responded to it. He had found a way to use his pain as a source of strength, to transform his hurt into a powerful call for change. Her pride for him was immeasurable. Malik's father, too, was impacted. He had always supported Malik, but now he saw his son's courage in a new light. He had watched as the story unfolded on social media, reading the comments, seeing the reactions of people from all over the world. And then, When Malik had taken the stage at the school assembly, speaking with poise and conviction, it became clear to him how far his son had come, not just as a young man, but as a leader, a voice for those who needed it most. But it wasn't just Malik's family that had rallied around him. The ripple effect had touched people from all walks of life. His school became a place of deeper reflection on issues of race and prejudice, and the conversation didn't end with the assembly. Teachers, administrators, and students alike began to engage in workshops and discussions about bias, empathy, and social justice. The lessons that Malik had learned on that flight, painful as they were now being shared with others in a way that would help prevent future injustices. The Diversity Club, which had first approached Malik to speak at the assembly, now worked with him on organizing forums and discussions where students could talk openly about their experiences with discrimination, both personal and systemic. They invited local activists and experts to come speak, and Malik found himself in the unexpected role of a mentor, helping to lead the discussions that were changing the hearts and minds of his peers. Every conversation, every shared story, was another brick in the foundation of a more inclusive community, and Malik felt both humbled and proud to be a part of it. Even the media continued to track Malik's journey. After his school assembly speech, several reporters reached out for interviews, asking him to speak about the broader implications of his story and how young people could play a role in fighting discrimination. Malik, at first hesitant to step back into the public eye, realized that this was another opportunity, an opportunity to continue the conversation, to push the boundaries of understanding, and to make sure that what happened to him would not be swept under the rug. One of the most moving moments of this ongoing journey occurred when Malik was invited to a community event aimed at raising awareness about racial equality. The event was being organized by local civil rights groups, and they had asked him to speak alongside prominent leaders in the fight for justice. It was an honor he hadn't expected, but as soon as he stepped onto the stage, he felt the gravity of the moment. The crowd was filled with a diverse group of people, families, activists, educators, and young people like himself, all united by a desire to make a difference. As he looked out over the crowd, Malik felt a surge of emotion. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about the countless others who had faced similar discrimination. His story was merely one piece of a much larger puzzle, and he understood now that the fight for equality and justice was not just his to fight, it was everyone's fight. He spoke to the crowd with a raw honesty, sharing his feelings of confusion, pain, and ultimately, strength. He talked about how Carla's decision to film the incident had been a turning point, how it had shown him the incredible power of solidarity, how one person's action could change everything. I never imagined that something as small as standing up for myself would become part of a bigger conversation, Malik told the audience, his voice steady and clear. But that's the thing about injustice. It doesn't just hurt one person. It affects us all. And when we stand together, when we use our voices, that's when change happens. It's not just one story. It's our story. The audience erupted in applause. But for Malik, the applause wasn't for him alone. It was for the entire community that had rallied around him, for the strangers who had seen something wrong and acted, and for the countless others whose stories had yet to be heard. As Malik continued to speak, he felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He wasn't just a teenager from a small town anymore. He was part of a movement that was pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable, a movement that was creating space for people to speak up and demand change. He had seen firsthand how one voice, one action, could make a difference. And now, more than ever, he understood the power of solidarity. Back home, Malik's family continued to witness the transformation in him. His mother, in particular, was amazed by the maturity Malik had gained through this experience. She had always known he was a thoughtful and reflective young man. But this was different. Malik was beginning to understand the true depth of his voice, the significance of his actions, and the impact they could have on the world around him. She could see that, while the pain of what had happened would never fully fade, It had given him a sense of purpose that he had never known before. The changes were not confined to Malik's school or his community. The airline that had been at the center of his ordeal began to take significant steps to address the systemic issues within their company. In the weeks following the public outcry, they implemented mandatory anti-bias and cultural sensitivity training for all employees, from flight attendants to gate agents and higher management. The airline issued a statement acknowledging the need for reform, and they took full responsibility for the actions of their employee, Sarah. But beyond the apology, Malik's story had forced them to reckon with the deeper issue of how their corporate culture had allowed such discrimination to take place. Though the road ahead for the airline, and for society as a whole, would still be a long one, Malik's experience had set a precedent, a reminder that accountability is essential, that change is possible, and that people's stories have power. Over time, Malik began to reflect more deeply on the lessons he had learned. He understood now that the fight for justice wasn't about winning in a singular, isolated moment. It was about a continuous, collective effort. The change he had witnessed wasn't a flash in the pan. It was the beginning of a broader movement, one that would take years to fully unfold. But the seeds had been planted. People were listening, and they were learning. They were beginning to understand that the small acts of courage, whether it was speaking out, recording an incident, or simply standing in solidarity, were the building blocks of real transformation. The ripple effect of Malik's courage had reached far beyond his own life. It had brought people together, sparked necessary conversations, and helped to forge a path toward a more just, inclusive society. And as Malik looked ahead, he knew that this was just the beginning. His voice would continue to be part of the conversation, not as a passive bystander, but as a leader, a young man who had found his purpose in the most unlikely of circumstances. In the end, it wasn't the injustices that defined Malik. It was how he chose to respond to them. It was his unwavering belief that, together, people could change the world, one voice, one action at a time. And with that, Malik knew that the fight for equality, dignity, and respect would never be over. The work was just beginning, and he was ready to be a part of it.